there is a faction in World of Warcraft that is entirely impossible for players to complete. In order to understand what is meant by a faction being impossible to complete, we must first take a look at how factions work. In World of Warcraft, players can interact with NPCs out in the world, and there are generally three categories of NPCs. The neutral, which often inhabit low-level starter zones. These NPCs will leave the player alone and only attack the player if they attacked first. The hostile, which accounts for most NPCs in the game, who will attack the player if they get too close. And the friendly, which are often quest givers, vendors or guards that will aid the player if they are attacked. These three types of NPCs are fairly standard when it comes to MMOs and games in general, but in World of Warcraft there exists a system which allows NPCs that are members of a given faction to change between friendly, neutral and hostile based on the player's reputation with that specific faction. While there is more to this, especially in later expansions, here is a rough overview of how factions work within the game. In the faction system, the player can have one of 8 standings with a faction, which may be improved or decreased based on the player's actions. These are hated, hostile, unfriendly, neutral, friendly, honored, revered and exalted. The two lowest standings, hated and hostile, will have the faction members attack the player on sight. Getting to unfriendly will make the faction no longer attack you, but they won't interact with you in any way. After getting to neutral standing, the faction will usually interact with the player, allowing them to buy goods and sometimes even offering them quests. Having a friendly standing, most of the faction's content becomes available to the player, with a few quests and vendor items still being off limits. At honored and revered, the player will gain access to more items, as well as getting a discount when buying. And finally, at exalted, everything that the faction has to offer becomes available to the player. This is where the reputation grant for the faction is considered to be complete. It is also at exalted that the faction counts toward the reputation related achievements. Most reputation grants will take a good while to complete, with some of them being more manageable than others. In this video, we will take a look at a faction that is not just difficult, but entirely impossible to complete. This is the story of the Syndicate faction. The story starts in 2004, when World of Warcraft is released, with the first patch, patch 1.1. Here, a lot of content and gameplay was not fully developed, and the factions were no different. Horde and Alliance players who ventured into the zones of Hillsbridge Foothills, Alterac Mountains and Arathi Highlands would encounter hostile members of the Syndicate faction. Oftentimes, killing faction members lowers the player's reputation to the faction, but when players killed the Syndicate units, nothing happened at this time. Upon completing a repeatable quest in the Ravenhold Manor, located in a secluded area in the mountains between Hillsbridge Foothills and the Hinterlands, players would gain 50 reputation with the Ravenhold Manor, but also lose 250 reputation with the Syndicate. This was the first time that players would receive an adjustment to the Syndicate reputation, which could now be viewed in the Character Reputation tab. The quest was labeled as Rogue only, but this was not actually the case, as any class could just pick up the quest and complete it, although rogues did have a much easier time gathering the quest items. Seeing this connection between the Ravenhold and the Syndicate faction, players switched on the Add War toggle with the Ravenhold Manor faction and attacked the guards. Surprisingly, upon being killed, they would award the player with 1 reputation for the Syndicate, but meanwhile decreasing the player's reputation with the Ravenhold by 25. This was the first, and soon to be discovered, only way of increasing reputation with the Syndicate. This led to a lot of grinding, as players, by default, started with a hated standing with the Syndicate faction. Not deterred by this, players went to work and killed Ravenhold guards over and over. While a lot of players just had the goal of reaching unfriendly, where the Syndicate would no longer attack them on sight. Some players pushed on and eventually hit neutral after killing no less than 10,000 Ravenhold guards. Players who made it this far now became stuck at neutral, as killing Ravenhold guards would no longer award any reputation with the Syndicate. After searching for other means of increasing reputation with the Syndicate, players finally gave up and concluded that the faction was not possible to complete at this time. This was not as unique as one might think, as there were actually 2 other impossible factions which also made it into the game on release. These 2 were the rivaling clans of Gelkis and Magram, located in the Desolate Zone, which at this time couldn't be completed either. While the Syndicate was just one of 3 impossible factions, this wouldn't be the case for long. As on patch 1.5, the Horde-specific Riventusk faction was added, with their main and only hub being located out the coast of the Hinterlands. This new faction was very incomplete, only having a few quests that would increase reputation. As a result, a player could not even reach friendly standing with the faction before they would run out of quests, none of which were repeatable. In the same patch, the Alterac Valley battleground was also added, and what a lot of people don't know is that in the very first version of the Alterac Valley, the Syndicate actually had a presence within the battleground. Hoping for new quests or other interactions with the faction, players who had reached unfriendly or neutral with them would visit, only to learn that they were completely hostile despite having the gear as well as the tag of the Syndicate. In the end, this didn't matter too much, as the Syndicate was removed from the Alterac Valley in patch 1.8, just 3 patches after the battleground's introduction. In patch 1.11, the very unfinished Riventusk Trolls faction would also go on to be removed. And by the end of Vanilla WoW, these 3 factions, the Gelkis clan, the Magrum clan and the Syndicate, were once again the only 3 factions to be impossible to complete, a title that they would share for the next many years. The Syndicate's main enemies, the Ravenhold Manor, did receive more work in future expansions, with additions such as quests and having NPC kills award reputation. And while the Syndicate reputation was made easier, having the reputation gained per kill increased from 1 to 5, the Syndicate reputation could still only be increased by killing Ravenhold members, and as was the case from the very beginning, this reputation could not surpass neutral. After 12 years since the removal of the Riventusk Trolls, the Syndicate would finally become the last and only impossible faction. When a quest had its rewards adjusted in patch 8.1 when the Battle for Azeroth expansion released. Upon completion, the player now gained Exalted standing with both the Magrum and the Gelkis clan, and those who had already completed the quest prior to this change could now talk to an NPC who would award the reputation right away. Seeing this change that was made in the Desolate Zone, players now started looking around the Hillsplit Foothills, Alterac Mountains and the Arathi Highlands Zone, hoping that something similar was added to the Syndicate reputation, which unfortunately wasn't the case. And from this point onwards, the Syndicate remains to be the last and only faction currently available in the game that players cannot reach Exalted with, by any means. Whether or not the Syndicate finally receives updates or continues in its current state will be up for time to decide, but with almost 19 years of being capped at neutral, it could be argued that the faction serves better as a window into a time long ago when World of Warcraft was new and packed with ideas that didn't all make sense and weren't all completed in their entirety.